Hello everyone, so in this video we talk about the First Crusade. Now it's obvious that we cannot condensate in one video the huge event that the First Crusade actually was. I will surely make tons of videos about crusades in the future and about very specific topics. I'm extremely fascinated, for instance, about crusader warfare. But this is not gonna be it. It's not gonna be a military history video. It's not gonna be not even a strictly political video. It's like saying, let's look in outline at this phenomenon. So it's thought for beginners or for people who want to have just a broader picture of the world. So as I think all of you already know, the First Crusade was launched by a call at the Concilium of Clermont in France by Pope Urban II, that found an immediate response especially in those more humble and marginal components of society that incidentally had given a very important contribution, especially from a moral and propagandistic point of view, to that movement of reform that the church had undergone during the 11th century, and that was still in act. So it's important also to consider the First Crusade in this perspective of the general reformation of the church and on the general increasement and commitment that the popes had, flirting with the idea of essentially becoming, the leaders of Christendom, not just from a spiritual point of view, but also from a secular point of view. So it's also very particular context in many ways, from a spiritual, cultural, political, economical, and social, and even military point of view, that favored the First Crusade. And it's very difficult to even think, about the causes as themselves, as really thinking like a person of those times. The first thing we can say here in synthesis is that it was a group of very diverse causes that, as it happens in history sometimes, eventually converged, making possible this enterprise that would change the face of the world in many ways. So these first, the call of Clermont, so a first expedition that started already during the spring of 1096. The call of Clermont had been in 1095, and this is what we remember as the first expedition of the First Crusade, or the Poor's Crusade, because it was essentially preached among the masses by priests or other men of religion that had a great charisma, especially in popular culture. Let's think about the leading role that in here assumed Peter of Amiens, better known as the name of Peter the Hermit, so Pierre of Amiens. He was a northern French, but it also had the backing of a first group of nobles that wouldn't be essentially the ones who would follow in the second expedition, the one who eventually caught Jerusalem, like Gautier, I believe it's in French, sans avoir, which means Walter, the one who has no properties, no goods. So nobles that were greatly impoverished at the time, and that so this experience of the crusade as I have nothing to lose, I'll go there. As the Pope promised, I might, I might reach the kingdom of heaven by participating to what was believed as an armed pilgrimage. Most of all, it wasn't really considered as a military expedition. It was much more complex, and especially this first movement expresses it beautiful, because the second expedition was actually a pretty great feat from a military and logistical point of view. It was organized by the barons. In fact, the the expedition, the second expedition of the First Crusade proper, was led essentially by professional and very powerful noblemen of the higher, the higher nobility of Europe. But we'll be seeing that. But this first expedition was instead something that came from the poor guys. So there were a lot of noblemen, a lot of knights all over Europe that kind of had no goods, like Gautier Saint-Nouvoir, who were usually cadets, that is, second-born male sons, because usually it was this is the father the father goods were usually inherited by only the firstborn male. At this point, it wasn't rarely more shared, so there were a lot of cadets who usually went, becoming priests in the private or dynastic, in fact, even monasteries or abbeys, and other cadets that instead would be knighted and become so-called errant knights, and seemingly and renownedly, one of the reasons that seemingly, the put in motion the crusade was, even the need concerted by the Pope and the major political players of the time to get rid of all this mass of violent thugs that populated Europe at the time, which doesn't mean obviously the old knights were bad people or usually violently sick bastards who just wanted to rape and pillage, but let's say that there was still presence of that sort, and pushing these guys towards the frontiers of Christendom was seen, in order to expand Christendom itself, was seen as a good thing to do, essentially. And this also has to be explained from a social but also economical point of view, because now Europe is on the rise, and there is all this force, which is also demographic force, that has to expand somewhere, and there is this great progress of expansion that in fact has to do with the rebirth of the 11th century and all these things. So this makes you well understand how complicated really the causes and mixed the causes of the First Crusade and the Crusades in general were, and therefore this first expedition kind of grew, kind of organized itself very autonomously and very disorderly in many ways. So we're talking about some thousands of people, so there weren't even so many, but they kind of came from all the areas of Europe, and of Christian Europe, of course, and it included, telling the truth, not so differently from the other armies of that time. Here, this wasn't really an army, militarily speaking, but it would be normal, like in this case, there would be within these expeditions, women, sick people who maybe wanted to get a miracle for having gone to the Holy Land, and old men and old people and even children that put themselves into march. Even sometimes it's difficult to understand the spiritual tensions or the mindsets of those times, but really you have to imagine that most of these people, maybe exactly because they were so poor, didn't have nothing to lose, and therefore they simply joined these preaching priests who were calling for the crusade and heading towards the Holy Land. Now the routes they took were mostly the Rhine Valley and the Danube ones. That would be eventually the same ones that were used afterwards by the Crusaders, who mostly came from regions like Belgium, France, and they began quite settling. This is a very dark chapter. I talked about it in my video about the First Crusade, so go check it out if you want to get some more information. So they became immediately to hunt the so-called infidels and slaughtering them. Now it's a very tragic chapter of the Crusades, as many others. We're not talking about pink rabbits and tender flowers here. It's a brutal world in many ways, and around the crusade were kind of catalyzed many acts of violence and of sacking that weren't just fueled by ideological adversities or enmities, but also by sheer logistical needs, for instance, because these were thousands of people who had to eat and to be fed in order to arrive to the Holy Land. So with a logistical base that they didn't have, because they weren't really organized at that level, and they began to massacre a lot of people, and especially the wealthy Jewish communities of Germany. That were kind of the first, victims of the crusade. I don't want to put it ideologically speaking. I'm not giving a negative or positive connotation of the crusade, but I think that the Jewish example here is important to mention, if anything, because in the 20th century still we had an Holocaust, and in parts of of the violence and the ideological positions that were found in medieval times were still present in large part of the European anti-Semitism that was at the base of of very large consensus in many areas of Europe, even during mass society. So these pilgrims that were supposed to go freeing the Holy Land eventually began to slaughter into their fanatism and blind hate and even other more trivial interests of robbing and something like that, to persecute the Jews in the name of Christ. Now, I also here I have nothing against Christianism in itself. I just wanted to point out how this basically happened. So it wasn't necessarily just a Christian reason, but obviously even in Christian terms you can do bad or wrong. So evidently these people did wrong. And the first attack against the Jewish communities was in Speyer, which is in southern Germany. It happened May the 3rd of 1096. So even early, here these guys were already in motion through southern Germany. Basically 12 people were burnt alive inside of a synagogue. So that's a very dark picture, and similar massacres were carried out also in other German cities like Worms, Mainz. Here we seemingly had 1,000 people killed. Köln, Cologne, if you want to say the French way, Trier, Metz, and even Prague. So here, Prague, it's kind of eccentric from the paths we talked about, the Rhine and the Danube, but it tells how many little streams from all over Europe came to build up these first expedition. So at this point, it had even usually to do with a religious point, but it was just a habit seemingly of sacking, of raiding and killing that wasn't expanded even in other levels of society. So that local communities, both noblemen and peasants, became to react again at the passage of this very unruly and violent group. And in Hungary, so if you follow the Danube from Germany, you get in there. The Hungarians inflicted a very heavy blow to this, let's say, army of desperates. And this is what happens when you start, exaggerating. And however, the first expedition kept moving towards the east. It went down up to Constantinople, so passing even through very harsh lands for those times. It seems that the Bulgarians were quite ferocious, and also attacked the pilgrims and so on. And they finally got into Asia. They got into today's Turkey, where the Turks had already been settled, and famously enough, the same Turks basically slaughtered the entire expedition. And one of the few survivors was Peter the Hermit, who actually had remained behind, or if I'm not wrong, he had kind of fled, came back to I don't know where on the Turkish coast because it was Byzantine ruled, and that was a way to get aids, etc. For the expedition, but it sounds much more an excuse. We don't know actually. Maybe Peter the Hermit was just lucky, but there was probably also some part of cunning here. And in fact, Peter the Hermit would live on to witness the sack of Jerusalem of 1099. Now, so this first expedition was kind of failed. There were certain reactions to it, in the sense that even though it had been something so unruly and violent and coordinated, it was still seen as, the Turks that also occupied the Holy Lands in the Near East have exterminated our good Christian fellows who had went there for freeing the Holy Sepulchre, etc. So this event was kind of used to, giving a bit more of a passion towards the actual expedition that eventually was mounted up. And this was carried out after a short while in the same 1096. So getting to the official crusade in many ways, we have to talk that this was called as I was saying before, the Crusade of the Barons, because differently from the first expedition, was actually made up by some of the some of the greatest representatives of the feudal Europe of that time, that were mostly from the French area. That was the one at the time in which feudalism had already spread significantly, while other areas of Germany, for instance, or southern France, were kind of different in many ways. They had a relatively more egalitarian society, which, by the way, couldn't build up, these extremely strong mounted cavalry force like the French were having. So, and obviously, this the Barons' Crusade was a much more intelligent thing than the first one. It was kind of very well planned, and even the outcome probably, even though not owes its success not just to luck, but to a pretty substantial organization that really reflects the very high level of military professionalism of the European mounted elites of the end of the 11th century. So who did participate among the big ones? Well, first of all, there was Hug of Vermandois, who was a brother of the French king. Then the extremely famous Godfrey of Bouyon, who was Duke of Lower Lorraine, and that would eventually become not really king of of Jerusalem, but he was the one who actually ruled it practically, because he refused to, as he famously said, I refused to wear a crown in a place where my lord was worn with a crown of thorns. So we have also to think about the true religious commitment of these people. In some of my videos, I kind of criticized the actual theological understanding of especially of these knights, military men who had a very low education in many ways. But we shouldn't feel that this superficial Christianization was more similar to the pagan contractualism, even in military affairs, like praying God for gaining victory, was accompanied also by probably a true belief in such things, and it was a world was still dominated by many emotional beliefs in many ways were felt collectively and individually. And I think that the First Crusade is probably one of the greatest, if not greatest, example of this spiritual tension that Christian Europeans felt when effectively marching towards for the reconquest of the Holy Lands. There were also other very notable fellows here. Was the son of William the Conqueror, Robert, who was Duke of Normandy. Then Raymond of Saint-Gilles, who was instead the Count of Toulouse in southwestern France. Now, the County of Toulouse was a pretty strong political and military entity at the time. It was, however, very autonomous from the northern French king, although it technically was part of the realm. This is a moment in which the French crown is really weak, and especially very territorial. Telling the truth, it's already strong at this time. It was very territorially limited, and this is the time in which the French kings began to expand their actual authority over the nominal vassals that they had in France, or in Western Francia, like it was still called until the 13th century. And Raymond of Saint-Gilles was probably also one of the greater, I can't say competitors to the French throne, because there were two different environments. Really, they didn't intermingle much in this sense, but there was definitely also kind of competitive prestige relatively to the participation of the Crusade, and all these kind of enmity that existed between nobles, even from the same kingdoms, and for power, etc. Notably, there was also there were also other Siculo-Normans in here of the Hauteville dynasty. So Bohemond and Tancred of Hauteville, who were respectively the son and the nephew of Robert of Sicily, who had excuse me, Robert of Hauteville, who had conquered the kingdom of Sicily. So kind of the best of the feudal world at that time. But as you see, there were no kings, because there were, and not other leaders, not even the Holy Roman Emperor, because at this time both the French king and the Holy Roman Emperor were excommunicated. So they weren't even called to participate in the crusade, because popes, and this tells you how popes were beginning to be powerful at this point, because they could literally move the whole European nobility without even bothering to, to ask their respective, sovereigns. And it also tells how weak, the centralization of kingdoms was at this point, and how feudalism could make rise substantial powers that could even compete with the royal or imperial one. And all these guys were in fact also under the guide of the Pope's legatus, Adhemar of Monteil. So you understand that here between the Normans, of England and Sicily, the French, the Belgians, etc. We're talking about a mostly French-dominated participation to the Crusade, and indeed, the Crusader phenomenon was mostly a French thing. The reasons are many and complex, but it can get down. They can get down to very few, considerations. First of all, that France was like the largest country at that time for sheer quantity of resources, etc. They could mount up such expeditions, etc. And also the fact that probably it was the most highly the most advanced country at that point, um, from a military point of view. I mean, resources and the craft of arms really went together at this point, because that's what feudalism was all about. So there were enough resources from France, and you know, um, um, the and French models like Norman ones that had been exported to England and Sicily, that could mount up such big forces, mounted cavalry for going fighting effectively in the Holy Land. Um, and to this, mostly talking about feudal retinues, essentially, we have to add, however, a vital mean that was essentially the logistical support of the Italian maritime city-states. Firstly, Pisa and Genoa, so these cities that are on the Tyrrhenian Sea. That tells you that was actually a third route, that was the maritime one, because certain nobles, as we have seen, traveled from Benelux, let's say, through the Rhine and the Danube, choosing this, telling the truth, even more risky land route than passing to Asia and proceeding on foot, and instead the Western Mediterranean one, it essentially arrived to Marseille, and then from there to Genoa or Pisa, and then from there to Messina in Sicily, and then they would leave for the Near East. And we can say that without the Italian ships, there wouldn't be basically no way especially such logistical support could be used by the Crusaders. And obviously the Italians didn't do that for free. They were being paid for their galleys to be armed and stuffed with with food and other necessities for transporting this big amount of men, and the Italians also had other interests for doing so, because they thought that through the Crusades they could, first of all, many Italians also joined the Crusades in many ways, but these maritime republics especially aimed at seizing new ports on the Levantine coasts, so that they could kind of get the monopoly of the traffics in there, quite often in competition between each other, and therefore keeping to support the Crusaders in order to see assured from their land domains the access to their Mediterranean ports. And this was very important for the history of the Crusader states, because basically the Italians kept open this continuous channel with West for the Crusades, that could go like on a highway on there. Many people will say, but yeah, traveling by sea was dangerous at that time. Wasn't it better to go on land? Well, no. it was no... the maritime traffics weren't more risky than the land ones. First of all, they were extremely cheaper compared to the land ones, because they used wind forces, or maybe oar forces, but it was much faster and quicker than going through land. Through land you can have the worst problems, you can get logistical problems and illnesses, because you lack food. This can happen in galleys too, but it's a much quicker travel, and the Italians armed well their ships, and especially on land you could meet, like it had happened for the first expedition, Hungarians or Bulgarians, etc., that weren't quite happy about you passing to their own lands, and rightfully. And even Byzantines were these kind of gentle souls, so were the Westerners, and the whole thing was reciprocated, let me tell you. We gotta talk about the Byzantines here in a while. So, in fact, the well, yeah, relatively to the Italians, just adding the simple fact that eventually the Crusades had success and they got those ports and or warehouses in coastal cities that were, vital for their trade with the East, and that channeled also a lot of civilization, because these traffics with the East even brought new ideas, new technologies from the Byzantine and Arab world that were quite advanced scientifically for those times. And a lot of the development of Western Europe in those centuries passed essentially through those ports. So relatively to the Byzantines, I must say that here, they're kind of a very fascinating topic, according to me, as always, because normally when thinking about the Crusades, we think like, yeah, it was the Christians like against the Muslims. Yeah, it was so clash of cultures, of civilization, but it wasn't really like that. It wasn't much of a big ideological match between Christianity and Islam. It was much more complex and variegated. Were definitely Christians fighting from the Muslim side, as well as Muslims fighting from Christian side. It was much more a matter of interest. And talking about interests, obviously the Byzantines were much happy that there would be these very warlike and powerful Western armies crossing their lands to the Holy Land. Now, the Byzantines would deserve a chapter on their own, relatively to the First Crusade, because they had a completely different mindset from the Western one. First of all, it was absurd for them that a bishop like the Pope would call a war over secular rulers, since in the Byzantine Empire, the emperor had always been an absolute monarch, and the church even was subjected to him, and especially they feared that the Westerners who were definitely on the rise and would surpass the Byzantine civilization, and even in terms of military and economical capabilities in a few centuries, would aim at Constantinople. Now, thinking that in the First Crusades there were Sicilian Normans that were the same guys who had invaded the Byzantine Empire in Epirus a short time before, and that now aimed to the major cities of the empire were Thessalonica and the capital Constantinople itself. So these weren't really nice guys in the eyes of the Byzantines, and nor the Byzantines were in the eyes of them. And there were also a lot of other cultural differences, like for instance, and which were even appreciated and admired by the Byzantines. And sometimes the Byzantines believed they were like the best in the world. They felt themselves as the Romans, as those who were the most intellectually developed, the most powerful, the more disciplined militarily speaking. But they kind of admired, and we know this from Anna Komnena's diary, that that the Byzantines highly admired this very rough, a bit uneducated, definitely completely uneducated, telling the truth, Western, let's say Frankish barons, because that's how they call them, the Franks. Um, but yet they recognize their utmost courage, in the sense that they highly appreciated the spirit individual warring skills of the Western knights. This maybe kind of had a bit more of cliches that were connected to the fact that the Byzantines kind of looked at the modern peoples through the lenses of classical antiquity for kind of intellectual elitism. So there was a bit this stereotype that the Westerners, especially of Germanic tradition or descent, were kind of extremely courageous, extremely brave individually speaking. They couldn't do anything, but were still individually, the most brilliant fighters probably of all the barbarians from the Byzantine point of view. But it's also objective that a Christian, the Western chivalry of that time, Western knighthood implied these kind of values. They were still very strongly individualistic and warlike ethos that was perfectly embodied by men like, by Tancred of Hauteville. So even and it's interesting because in here the Byzantines basically recognized the strengths and valor of their bitterest rivals. So it's kind of fascinating how, and in turn the Westerners were extremely fascinated by the luxus and the riches of Constantinople, even though they criticized these emperors that kind of were that they sat on top of everyone, essentially on this very high, on this throne that was so high, and that all the others were down. And it was kind of for the Western feudal culture of that time was something incomprehensible, because that aristocracy had a strongly egalitarianism towards among the nobility. I mean, the peasants were like, even non-humans in a certain sense in their view. But the nobles were still kind of all equal. Even kings were felt like, the first champions of among all for military value, but they kind of couldn't prevail more than much over the feudal nobility. Now, watching these, fast and the rituals of the Byzantine court were extremely cold and solemn, etc., they kind of laughed and were irreverent about them. So these are all things we might talk more in detail in another video. But relatively to the First Crusade, the expedition of the barons, the Byzantines acted essentially in this way. They didn't stop the Westerners, or also because they didn't want to to clash with them, because they were effectively a force to be reckoned with, and there was even the risk that they could attack Constantinople, as it would have happened just more than a century afterwards, and successfully, telling the truth. But I kind of thought of using these crusaders for their foreign policy. So they actually helped the Crusaders by supporting them logistically, giving them food, etc., even weapons, etc., at the condition that all the territories that the Crusaders would conquer from the Turks, they would came into the Byzantine hands. Now this is the kind of, this tells you so much about the Byzantine mind, the idea that they had to by right, because was the real point here, they had to by right reconquer, telling the truth, that by right the Byzantines believed that they owned every single piece of land that the Romans had ever conquered in the past. So obviously it was a much larger area than the one they ruled at that time, and they felt as a duty the reconquest of these territories. So technically speaking, they said, let's try, to, and the Crusaders accepted, because especially even if the dukes were extremely efficient logistical logists, and they knew how to bring great masses of warriors and into a foreign land, in a place, by the way, that they didn't even know, that they still had a lot of troubles feeding their armies. So obviously they accepted all the Byzantine requests by word, by even by allegiance, there were very ambiguous behaviors of the Crusaders towards the Byzantine Emperor at this point, which is fascinating because there was a kind of recognition that was a Roman Empire still, not just in the West as they had tried to reform um, with the Holy Roman Empire, but there was a Constantinopolitan Roman Empire that was even probably and rightfully more important than the Western one at this point, still at this point. And they kind of agreed. They said, okay, we will give you back all the land we conquer. Now, these were all words, and it's also ironic because among both the Westerners and the Easterners, there was this idea of that the word had to be respected, that oaths and so had to be, the word sacred, but incidentally, they didn't respect their promises, not from one side nor from the other, because the Crusaders didn't give anything to the Byzantines. But also the Byzantines never really didn't really help the Crusaders logistically as they had promised, telling the truth. Yeah, they gave them some food and some weapons, but it kind of seems that the food was poisoned sometimes, that weapons were fragile, because there was a kind of sabotage towards an army that, although with peaceful purposes, was still a threat into the Byzantine lands. So, yeah, we can't say that they were sneaky for the sake of it, but there were objective reasons for distrusting each other. So now I should talk about all the military um, how the campaign here into Muslim land actually progressed. But it's a very complex thing. There was the Battle of the Ilium. There was this first ambush, then the Turks did into the Anatolian plateau against the Christians, and there is the first clash in this battle, which is quite interesting. The first big clash between the Crusaders and the Turkish. The Crusader feudal knights and the Turkish horse archers. There are many interesting points that can be made strategically and logistically and even tactically in here, but we don't have much time. Let's just say that the Crusaders went through Anatolia, then through Syria, and it was pure luck that they actually made it to Palestine, because the logistical situation was dreadful. The environment was semi-arid. They didn't have to drink. They didn't have to eat. The Muslims of the area, the areas in which they passed, literally tempested them and harassed them continuously with their arrows. It was a situation of perpetual danger in many ways. Now, what is fascinating about the First Crusade from the Muslim side is that the Muslims seemingly didn't have this great perception of what the Crusade had been. I mean, until basically Jerusalem didn't fall, but even afterwards, it seems that the Muslim world kind of underestimated the Westerners in many ways, and it's probably part of the reason why eventually the Westerners actually made it for a while to get in there and to take and to keep those territories for a couple of centuries. It seemingly the greater shock that the Muslim world actually had was instead the one that would come in the 13th century from the east, and that is the Mongolian Advance. And I think the comparison is interesting because it even gives you probably a dimension of the phenomenon, in the sense that the Westerners were kind of underestimated, the Mongolians were instead conceived like, the most powerful force on earth. And indeed, the Mongolian presence actually left more traces in the Middle East in many ways. But there is one point I would like to make about the strategical dimension of this, and especially, which is more of a cultural one, telling the truth, which is thinking at people like Godfrey of Bouyon, who was a Belgian guy who probably, had many great political, a great political and military involvement in the matters of Central Europe, etc. But he was still kind of very, I don't know how to say, um, a very, like all the knights of those times in the West, very rude person in many ways. He was uneducated. He didn't know the world. And yet, these people made it from Belgium to Syria and Palestine. It were lands that they probably didn't even know where they were. But still, they managed to arrive there. Now, obviously, even cartography and the view of the world of that time was enormously different from our one, since we are grown old with, satellite pictures and a perfect geographical knowledge. Mm, Journeys in those times were carried out in a different way, but it kind of worked at the same time. But it's still remarkable that from this relatively, awakening Europe that hadn't much known about the East for a long time, these guys kind of said, okay, from Belgium, where I have to go? Jerusalem, fine, let's go. And they made it. And to me, this is, as a military historian, an extremely beautiful proof of the organizational capabilities of the Westerners at this time. Because sometimes we exchange the idea of, remaining of feudal Europe as a kind of an idling place where people kind of only could move armies for a limited period of times for, even technological impediments. But this is completely false. These guys could mount expeditions like the one of First Crusade in a blink of an eye, without previous, expectation, because it was quite of a sudden thing if you think about it, and to carry out this and to make it. Now, it is true that in the First Crusade, as was saying before, there was also a lot of luck involved, which is not it doesn't really tell us it all, because here it's also a matter of, continuing this expedition in spite of all the odds that are definitely unfavorable, in which you can find, however, a lot of moral resources from the Christian side, in the sense that, for instance, what happened in front of Antioch, that was a Muslim city at that time, a Muslim-held city at least, it was besieged, and at that point, it is a very famous event in military history. These crusaders besieged a city that was apparently impregnable, and yet they were starving, they didn't have to drink, it was a kind of a mess there, but they kind of came up with things like they had found the Longinus lengths of they kind of came up with the ideas of miracles, of God's support. And this tells you how resourceful these people really were, because in those conditions, I don't know if it was fate, really these people truly believed in God, and they were so actually resilient because of that. But it was also more, it can't be just about that, because there were also a lot of other Christians who succumbed in other situations, in comparable situations. It was really about a world civilization. It was on the rise from Western Europe, and I think that even the fact that these episodes have been recorded historically speaking really proves how the same civilization was aware of these merits, of this identity, of these beliefs, and they kind of understood that they had made it also thanks to them. Because it's obvious, it was an armed pilgrimage. It was mostly a Christian journey there. It was not conceived, even this military expedition of the Barons' Crusade, it wasn't conceived like a military expedition. It was conceived as a pilgrimage. So it was all about God. It was all about doing something for achieving something greater in a Christian perspective for those times, of course. Which kind of dominated the whole thing, and probably the First Crusade, even afterwards, because the First Crusade was really the only one that actually worked. all the other crusades were kind of of failures to a certain extent, at least. Yes, there was some success in several occasions, but the whole thing was never as brilliant, as good as the First Crusade. The First Crusade was conceived like a mythical event. Think even of those who had gone to the First Crusade, and they would come home. They were revered like heroes, like saints, like by people to whom God had showed blessing and victory in His name. So think about even the memories of these people, between oral and written tradition. I'm thinking about the First Crusade. It was like the great success, the great yes that God basically told um, to the Christian society of the time, and all the further failures were criticized in comparison to the First Crusade, which succeeded in spite of all the odds, because even the following crusades were kind of easier for the Crusaders in many ways, and they screwed up things. Sometimes the Second Crusade was a complete. It was called the Shame of Damascus, because they basically had all the possibilities, and they fucked it all up. So it was even conceived in terms of God's judgment in many ways. So to make the long story short, basically the Crusaders began to conquer some of the major Muslim-held cities in the Near East, mostly in Syria and Jerusalem, that were, this in the coastal area, to which, historically speaking, civilization had mostly spread on the coasts since the ancient world. Then there was the Arab desert east, and then Mesopotamia was beyond that. So cities like Tripolis, Edessa, Acre, etc. were kind of the most important centers that the Crusaders have actually got to conquer along the road. And Jerusalem is at the bottom, the south. So it was the last one. It was the big, it was the big thing, telling the truth. Basically, Jerusalem was put under siege in 1099. I'm really passing all the traverses and problems through which the Crusades had passed to arrive until there. This was also another big city. It was actually the largest one that Crusaders faced. Unless you don't want to consider Constantinople, over which they had, gazed with interest. So it was a kind of a logistical problem even to besiege it, because, a large city implies that if you don't surround it completely, it can be served and helped by external aid, and you might be besieging it for nothing, basically. And instead, the Christians made it, and especially here there is a special contributions of the Italians that were mostly a maritime force, as we've seen, at least in the participation this crusade, this specific crusade, and we owe the capture of Jerusalem to the peasant sailors, because the problem for the Christians besieging Jerusalem is that they had no siege equipment. So there was no wood, there were no resources apparently. So what the peasants did was to basically chop down their own ships to build from them siege towers, and those were siege towers through which the Christians took Jerusalem. Italians were also very skilled crossbowmen, which is a weapon that spreads enormously into the west during the Crusader times, from the east, and the Italians, having been usually more in contact with with the Near East had already kind of adopted these weapons, and they, especially for naval warfare, but also for siege warfare, was extremely effective. So there was also, together with Crusaders, this Italian um, participation that eventually was recognized even by Godfrey of Bouyon, because I don't remember where. I don't think I'm not sure whether it was actually Temple of Solomon or wherever. I should check that out. But basically, Godfrey of Bouillon made um, um, made engraving into a door of Jerusalem, the fact that Jerusalem had been taken thanks to the peasants, and that place, the word that symbolized Jerusalem as a wall, was basically taken, basically belonged morally to the peasants. Now his successor would make that engraving destroyed, because he didn't want the peasants to kind of interfere too much with the policy of the local kingdom of Jerusalem that was effectively created after the Crusade conquest. And now this is important because it tells you how much the Italian maritime republics were committed to the crusading enterprise. You could say all they cared was making money, right? So once they had brought the Crusaders there, it was, just about hoping they would make it because they wanted money. Yes and no. They actually probably believed in the enterprise themselves. Italy was a country of very old Christianization. They participated largely also in their resources for this enterprise. So it kind of was a lot of Europeans that were sometimes far from each other coming together, acting as one, which definitely adds to the mythical dimension of the First Crusade in many ways. So the sack of Jerusalem that followed after the Crusaders took the city walls was some of the darkest episodes in medieval history. Basically, the Crusaders were so galvanized by the victory, and they were probably even so stressed and and kind of out of their mind, because think about the physical effort, all this ideological propaganda, this thing that was like the last step. They basically massacred world population, and mostly the Muslim and Jewish populations, but also sometimes also the Christian one, because there were a lot of Christians already living in Jerusalem. It doesn't matter that there were Turks ruling there, the pilgrims still arrived. In fact, there is also myth relatively to the fact that the Turks had actually blocked the pilgrimage, the Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. There was a lot of harassment more than else. There were taxes to pay and stuff. But before the Crusades, there were kind of contractors that could take you to the Holy Land and defend you militarily speaking. This is, by the way, how the Normans rose to power into southern Italy, as contractors for the pilgrims going to the Holy Land. And telling the truth, the Turkish presence had even contributed to strengthen this, the organization of Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land previously. So it was kind of a permeable and fluid dynamics that actually surrounds the crusade, and makes you understand it wasn't really much of a religious thing. That was an extreme need to convert everybody there. No, the only the only point was really retaking the Holy Land into the holy places into Christian hand. Then there was an extreme need of of religious conversion, etc. And there is, in fact, a lot of debate on whether crusades can be considered as religious wars, really. If you talk about 17th century Europe and 30 Years' War, there were wars of confessions that were obviously fought even there for political and economical interests, etc. But they were still fought formally over the fact that there were Catholics and Protestants. Here, it wasn't much of Christians against Muslims. It was just about Christians thinking as themselves as Christians and needing to recover the holy places. And that they didn't care to convert anyone. I mean everyone, in the sense that everybody living in Jerusalem had to be Christian. No, basically the Crusaders and those who remained there basically adapted even to the customs and of the local administration. There was a lot of tolerance in many ways, but at the same time, and not in modern sense of the word, but in this sense of balance between, ethnic and religious groups inhabiting in a certain place together. So you can't see these massive bloodsheds like the sack of Jerusalem, into which seemingly the blood arrived, according to saying and tradition, to the knee of the horses. Um, but you can read that more as a kind of in an anthropological fashion rather than into a religious one. This is at least my major perspective, because such acts of cruelty can, and really, first of all, made an impression already in the Christian culture of that time. So this means that Christian culture at that time had kind of ability of recognizing, I can't say its own faults by, in full, but they could at least perceive the gravity of the situation. But you have to think that the rest of the world was, was not immune from that. In their small, communities scattered all over Europe, Asia, etc., people massacred each other daily. Even in Christian Europe, you have seen with the night cadets, there are people who try to say, yeah, it wasn't much that every cat at night was a robber or a killer, but there were still, they still lived in an extremely violent world. Was dialectics, was highly polemical and conflictual, and resulted regularly on bloodshed. So the sack of Jerusalem can, can surprise us, and as it surprised the contemporaries, but it was mostly the fact that it was Jerusalem and there were a lot of people massed together and killed rather than violence in itself. And yet, as I was saying, it's still very meaningful that it was recorded even by the same Christians as kind of an extremely violent thing for the morals of those times. So Godfrey of Bouyon created in Jerusalem the most powerful crusader kingdom. He wasn't, as I was saying before, he wasn't crowned king, but as advocatus, which literally means in Latin the one who is called to perform a certain task. But that can also be translated as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. And after his death, that happened in exactly in 1100, he was followed on the throne by his brother Baldwin, who had previously been Count of Edessa, which was a Syrian city that had been controlled by the Crusaders, since the time they arrived there. Before the capture of Jerusalem, and who kind of expanded the kingdom at that point, especially on the coastal area, probably backed also by the Italians who wanted to get the ports of the coast for their trade, and who kind of managed to strengthen the kingdom. And I've made a video about the kingdom of Jerusalem from an eminently, potential point of view, and I observed how technically it could really be a very big power, and both Godfrey and Baldwin, actually this potential was well exploited. They managed to send away the papal legatus that immediately wanted to control the political picture. the political landscape of the newly founded kingdom. They managed to reinforce the borders to to get a sort of political preeminence in the region, and it was also a region with pretty good natural borders that could serve to a defensive as well as offensive foreign policy. And this was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was the largest one. Eventually, in the north, there were other smaller crusader entities that had been conquered before Jerusalem. So there were these, for instance, the county of Tripoli, Tripoli being on the coast of Lebanon, being or Syria, I don't remember really, but it's at the border. The Principality of Antioch, which was probably, if I'm not wrong, the second most powerful entity in the Crusader states in the Near East, who had been seized by the Hauteville, so by the Norman Sicilians. I made a video about the rule of Norman Sicily, and I explained a little bit the importance of the Principality of Antioch for the Norman, for the Mediterranean policy of the Normans in the Mediterranean. The Byzantines weren't happy at all about that, you can imagine. So then the county of Edessa. Now the county of Edessa was a kind of some of the weakest power of the Crusader states, because it was first of all, it didn't have any access to the sea, so even in terms of logistical problems relatively to provisions and supplies, things were kind of rougher for them, and they also bordered more directly the Islamic powers that existed along the Euphrates. There was also a pretty nasty political entity that was the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, was basically created when the Seljuk Turks had invaded Armenia, and parts of the Armenians had fled to the Cilician coast where they had seized this kingdom. And the relation between the Armenians and the Crusaders wasn't so bright, because technically they were both Christians, even if in different ways. They kind of were in this situation with the Seljuk Turks all around, and then the Byzantines trying to take in Anatolia, and it was a hugely complex political gaming that one day I might want to quite foolishly to explain, because it's extremely complicated. And just for saying that these Armenians weren't these great friends of the Crusaders, on the contrary. We can say that doesn't matter which religion you were, which culture you were, you would be always watched your back at this point. Even the Crusader states themselves were sometimes in opposition one with the other. They kind of played maybe to resize one another by allying themselves with this or that power, the Byzantines or even Muslims, etc. So the main characteristics of the Crusader states and of Outremer, this is this beautiful French word that means these lands of across the sea. Outre means beyond, and mer, it's sea, which the word Outremer in French at that time began to equate in meaning Crusader states, because that was conceived as a whole in ensemble like Outremer, quite simply. And that also tells you how strong French influence in Crusades really was. And these Outremer states were kind of created as a perfect imitation of Western feudal states. So this was, many people say, yeah, it was kind of a mistake of doing that because, the local communities weren't really used to feudal, to live in a feudal system. There was a much more egalitarian um, social asset in the Islamic world preceding the Crusader invasions. Not because Islamic society was much more egalitarian, it was a matter of land distribution. These guys that came from France lived in a place in which there was one guy, the noble, who had a huge amount of land, and a lot of people simply live over this land, and to support him, to pay for his retinue and his power and prestige. And they were kind of all in the same boat, so it wasn't just a matter of exploitation, it was a kind of a lot of interaction. The Islamic lands at this point didn't have anything like that, and unless you don't take Persia, where there was actually feudalism that actually pre-existed the Islamization of Persia. But here in the Near East, the land subdivision was largely, were small and medium owners, landowners, which made probably, I can't say society more dynamic, because actually Western Europe at this time is already more dynamic than that, but there are also environmental factors here that I don't want to take into consideration. But let's say that it was a completely different world from the one of feudal Europe. And obviously these created problems. And the first thing that these various princes or kings in Outremer did was to immediately take land, the local land and local owners, and to entrust it to themselves as kings and to their own vassals. And the even before and this happened even before the actual conquest of the lands, meaning that these crusaders were already thinking in perspective of how it would have been to rule these lands in the future, even before conquering them. This is kind of optimistic minded attitude. And some certain people say that, well, this is kind of first European colonialism, something like that. I don't want to go as far as that. Telling the truth, I think it's a bit more complex. But let's say that it was definitely a weird experiment for the time. The impact of such of a very different culture on those lands, which, as I was saying, didn't create much strength. In fact, these Crusader states were quite weak in many ways. First of all, feudalism in itself carried this gene of competition, between the feudal lords, even against the king. So the feudal bonds really didn't confer great strength and solidity to the world political ensemble. And another point that I think is crucial is also that there were a few numbers of Westerners actually settling in Outremer. Because most of the Crusaders, when they had conquered the Holy Land, basically simply came back home. Because they thought, fine, I conquered Jerusalem, now heaven is mine, hello, I come back home. Think also about the traumatic experiences. These people having stayed for years out of home, having left also many riches and their wives and children, all the concerns that there were. So it was natural in many ways that coming from so far away would like to come back home at a point. So a very few people, a very few Westerners remained in the Near East, and they began to have for issues of sheer number with local population. And the problem here is that it's not that problem arose simply because there were Muslims there, but there were problems even with local Christian populations that had very different traditions and practices from the Christian, the Western European ones. So it wasn't really a problem of, saying Christian versus Muslim at this point. It was really a problem that goes much deeper in many ways. We have seen how, the Westerners distrusted the Byzantines and how the thing was reciprocal, and those were people that even inhabited in Europe, at least in large part. Yeah, the Byzantines still had parts of Asia, but were relatively close to West. So you can imagine in a place like Palestine, uh, what it would mean to have this new, because these were new invaders. We can't tell it the way we like, but basically that was it. So if there is an invader in your home, you really don't give so much about his religion at that point, but rather, other things, politics first, and obvious. So you have to think that these um, Western kings and Western noblemen that come into the Near East were also quite, arrogant people. Not because they were Westerners, but because feudal society was made like that. Being at the top of society meant that you believed to be the best in absolute terms. So there weren't many points in contact with local population, even though there is one element that is very fascinating, which is that when um, the Crusaders met the Turks, who weren't actually from the Near East. They had come from Central Asia and were horse riding people. So they had this kind of similarity relatively to horse um, horse riding traditions that really kind of made them similar, at least up to a certain extent, to the Western cavalrymen. Well, these two cultures kind of respected each other. They kind of felt the chivalric traditions. There was a lot of hate and violence and contempt towards each other, but they still recognized this kind of similarity of fighting on horseback, of believing in certain chivalric ideas. Um, Even if they were still very different societies in many way and in many ways, and obviously these civilizations even began to hybrid each other, especially through military affairs. Think about, the Crusaders remain essentially two centuries in the Near East, and there was a lot of cultural influence between the Christians and the Muslims at this point. So especially those people who lived for a long time in the Near East, having come from West and being Christians, etc., kind of became more, I can't say more tolerant, but they kind of began to fit better into the local place. There are many stories that we know, for instance, about certain crusaders that came freshly from Europe just to go into the Holy Land to fight against the Saracens, maybe for some weeks, and then coming back home, like Minutemen or stuff like that, just to say to have earned their share of heaven, let's say, who were completely ignorant of the local traditions and situations, and those crusaders who instead had maybe even been born there at a certain point, even kind of mediated between these two cultures and um, and, and and show, historically speaking, how humans really can deal with situations by becoming more malleable, more intelligent, through knowledge, indeed. And obviously we cannot make a video about the First Crusade without talking about those new religious orders that were so important in the crusading era and even beyond, that were born into Jerusalem itself, and that are usually named as monastic military orders because they were essentially warrior monks, knight monks, whose members well, were voted to a very peculiar lifestyle that actually resembled, if it wasn't analogous, to those of the other monks in let's say in the civilian world, if we can say something like that, that were poverty, chastity, obedience to the rule, and who basically were born as kind of special. I can't say special units because in modern meaning special units something very different from that, but it kind of were thought to be the most devoted, when not even most fanatic from a a warlike point of view in the clash against the infidels, and as defenders of those pilgrims that came to visit the holy places, because here that continuity of of defense that existed, as we've said before, through contractors that came from Europe to escort the pilgrims to the holy places, actually was kind of formalized by the monastic military orders in many ways. We also participated to warfare, broadly speaking, in the armies of the local Christian powers, but had chiefly the objective of preserving the holy places of Christianity for the pilgrims and defending them and escorting them when it was powerful. Now, anyone who has read or studied, I'm not an expert about the monastic military orders, but they're still very fascinating to me, and knows basically at which level of power they eventually rose, not just in the Holy Land, but also in Europe itself. Also because, telling the truth, the Near East was just one of the three frontiers that Christianity had, with the one with the Arab and one with the pagans. So there were obviously monastic orders all over Europe, because they also went fighting into Spain or into the Baltic lands, etc. So there were actually many orders. We usually, and today we will mention only the most important. But telling the truth, these these monastic orders actually were born sometimes quite autonomously, and maybe in very small numbers. And there are a lot of them, which about whom we don't really know much, because they kind of were born through forms of associationism that were analogous sometimes to those of the citizen corporations that existed in low medieval Europe, and that maybe had a very limited engagement. And sometimes these military orders would even carry out on their own military expeditions themselves that telling the truth, are remembered as crusades in their own regard. There haven't been just major crusades we remember on the history books. There have been literally hundreds of crusades, even in the Near East, related to the autonomous action of such groups of faithful. And obviously the most important probably were the Hospitallers of St. John, who were founded in 1113 and who exist still today, as a matter of fact, because they changed name according to the places in which they took refuge, especially during the Ottoman advance in the late medieval and modern era, and are their today's names is the Knights of Malta, quite famously, and they still exist. Their houses in Rome. Then there are the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, who had the task to protect Christ's tomb. The Knights of the Temple, the extremely famous and overly mentioned Templars, around whom so many legends were eventually built, who were eventually suppressed at a certain point and wiped out in France because but we will talk about that one day. And they called themselves Templars in 1220 when they were founded, because they had originally set their house into an ex-mosque that had been erected in the place where there had been the Temple of Solomon. So you can see here even mosques being reused by Christians, and all the process of progressive, adaptation to the local places. It's only in 1198 that there was the creation instead of another order that had a story that actually has more to do with the Baltic lands, that are the famous Teutonic Knights, that were the Order of Saint Mary, if I'm not wrong, that eventually settled in Hungary and then into Germany and northeast, that had northeastern Europe, that had basically the task of protecting, originally at least, the task of protecting the German pilgrims. Now this is very important, because in these differences of the monastic orders you find a great deal also of similarities, as I was saying before, between them and the corporations of Europe that sometimes were based on a national base. So these Teutonic Knights basically defended the German pilgrims. And eventually, as I was saying, were called eventually to fight against those pagan people of the northeastern Europe in the Baltic Seas, and were quite violently exterminated by them. So yeah, I believe this is, oh my god, this is probably the longest video I've done. And today I was even tired. I didn't want to make a video. So okay, for now let's stop. I think I told everything I had to. I hope you appreciated this video, and as always, if you liked it, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel to get further contents from me through the notification. That's basically what you do with the subscription. For this time, it's all. Thank you for listening. I wish you a great day or night wherever you are, and see you next time. Bye.